There once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy bawled, "Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me?" Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks, Councils at the Crossroads. We've got some councillors, former mayors, and people who are very actively involved in their community in this forum today. And I'd like to first of all welcome Ken Grundy from Narracourt. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Arnie.
And from Victoria, Don Auchterlonie. Welcome, Don.
Hi, Arnie.
No worries. Pleased to have you all here. Now, now councils. Why councils? Councils because councils are the, if you like, engaged in the community. They're the closest form of any sort of administration to the local people. And they're also the first opportunity that the individual has of engaging with representatives of government, being councils being an extension of the state government, the closest form where they can deal with local issues. And so I think it's very important that we look at councils and say, well, if we're going to start the rebuild, if we're going to start restoring order back into our communities and the interrelatedness of communities, exercise our freedom, then it's got to start at the grassroots. And so I'd like to welcome Ken Grundy to take the floor. Ken.
Thank you, Arnie. I think the points you've just made are key to what we're going to be talking about, because, you know, your local councillor, he's probably, or he or she, is probably someone that you know reasonably well. They either live in your town or the next village, and you can simply ring them up. You probably see them in the supermarket or the football, and you can discuss a point. Whereas when it comes to your state parliamentarian, he's probably long way from where you live, and much harder to contact. And of course, take it one step further, your federal member represents a big slice of your state, and when you're trying to contact him, he's bamboozled because he's got 60-odd thousand other people also trying to contact him, and your hope of impressing him with the troubles that you're concerned about are very thin. Anyhow, I think it'd be a good basis if we started on where does local government actually fit into this system of the various governments across Australia. And it's a bit of a misnomer to say that we've actually got three tiers of government. It's quite a common remark, and I don't criticise people for saying it because it's more or less become an accepted term. But technically, we only have two levels of government in Australia. We have the federal government, Commonwealth of Australia, and its constitution. And then we have the state governments, which of course were here before the federal government. And those state governments, they have the power to, under their Local Government Act, to create councils, facilities across the state. And councils have a boundary in which they operate. I don't mean a geographical boundary so much, but I mean a political boundary. You know, their tasks are rates, rubbish and roads, it used to be. Well, it's a little bit more than that now, but they have a special role. Now, there are people who say that local government is actually not lawful because it's not in the federal constitution. As I've just explained, it has nothing to do with the federal constitution. It's an arm of the state government, much like an education department or, say, the police department. So it's only natural that the state government will set those boundaries for those bodies.
Thank you for that, Ken. That's certainly an excellent opening salvo that sets the parameters for us to begin to understand. If we're going to talk about local government, we've got to get it into context. It is not a part of our constitution because it is not within the authority and responsibility of the federal government. It is a state matter. It is a state matter. And we've got to consider that the historical referendums that different collectivist governments were trying to bring the local councils within the jurisdiction of the Commonwealth Constitution, and that was firmly rejected. Now, these governments who tried to bring this in were all collectivist orientated. They wanted more power, and they were going to use the power to control state governments and essentially use local governments and essentially emasculate the state governments by doing that, by forming regional councils and then reducing finances to the point where the state governments were completely emasculated. This is a very important part of our history to understand the purpose behind policy. Yes, Don Auchterlonie.
Yes, well, we've agreed in this program some recent time that what's really important when you think about government is whether the ordinary person gets respected and has a chance to express his opinion or express the thing that he wants the government to do. Now, with the amalgamated councils, this is extraordinarily difficult. But it wasn't so difficult in Victoria prior to 1989. So in my particular area, prior to 1989, we had 3 council areas, and each council had a president. They had a secretary, an engineer as head of the staff, and each of those councils had 12 councillors making up their representative to represent the people. Now, in the current amalgamated council, we have a CEO, and I was in a meeting last night with our new CEO and 3 of her directors, they call them. So in this current amalgamated council, there are 9 councillors representing what 30 councillors represented in the previous area. So that is a concentration of power, and it's a removal of power from the ordinary person.
Thanks for that, Don. That's exactly right. You've got to consider that this was a deliberate policy to remove what was equitable representation within that local area. And that was just simply by numbers. I mean, the population since that time, 1989, might have gone up by 20 or 30%, whatever, in Australia, and yet the representation has gone down by a factor of at least 3 to 1. So quite significant change in representation just by numbers alone. And then, of course, you've got regional councils, you've got the chief executive officer and directors. I don't hear any words like public servants here. These are directors, these are delegates, and so they're essentially telling you what's going on instead of representing you. And so we've been disenfranchised by this whole. We've been hoodwinked. We've lost our freedoms, and we continue to lose them. So we've got to look at this very, very carefully on the basis of what did they do, because it's usually on the path of where we have come from is the answer as to where we need to go in order to remedy these things. Ken Grundy.
Yes, for a further extension of that decentralised power, which gives you the best contact point that we used to have before councils amalgamated. And I must admit it is still an option, but in South Australia there are very few councils who have the wards system, or in Victoria I think they might call it ridings, where the council area was divided up into mini electorates and you had 1 or 2 councillors representing that ward. So when you had a problem, personally I favoured just have one councillor in those wards, but they had this idea of sharing. So when you have a problem, you could contact that representative, just like we do with our state member of parliament, and you could say, righto, Councillor Smith, this is the problem I want you to attend to, and he was responsible to you. Whereas now, after amalgamation, and I repeat, it is an option, but most of the councils, particularly in the rural areas, have gone to no wards. In other words, the whole of that council area is one electorate. So that means that you in our case, we have to contact one of the 10 councillors to make our point. Now, you might ring 3 of them before you find somebody that's even give you a sympathetic ear. Whereas before, that one councillor, even if he declined to support what you're asking for, that was his on his head later on when it's election time.
Thanks for that, Ken. That's right. That when you were able to identify a representative in a ward, you pinned them down. They had nowhere else to go. Whereas when you've got 10 representing the whole council, it's a bit of slipperiness there, and it's certainly not accountability. Oh, I'm not going to do it. You move to the next, and you're actually what they're able to do is avoid responsibility, accountability, and of course that's no way for a representative to work those things through. I think it's really important that we establish that the purpose of councils originally was to fix local roads. That was what it was about, and then it evolved onto other things. And now in Victoria, they're talking about making it authority to impose fines and seize property, which is a long way from fixing roads. Don Auchterlonie.
Well, I had the, shall we say, experience of being a shire councillor. By default, really. I didn't set out to do it, but circumstances came about and they said, why don't you do it, Don? So I was a councillor for 4 years. But prior to that, I'd been involved in a ratepayers association. And that association operated for about 30 years, I think. And we were able to influence the council on a number of things. We had regular monthly meetings and we invited councillors to come and say their piece. And the other thing we were able to do at that time, according to the Victorian Local Government Act, was to have a poll of ratepayers on any proposed loan that the council intended to raise. So the rules were that you had to get a certain percentage of the ratepayers sign a poll, and then the council was obliged to hold a vote on, a petition, I mean. Then the council was then had to run a public poll. We never won any of the polls, but the fact that this was available did tend to put the brake on some of the things that the councillors were planning to do.
Thanks, Don. I think that's very important. It's not necessarily sanctions, but it's the threat of sanctions, or at least making them accountable, and where they just don't have license to just continue on. Because the fact is that when the CEOs and the directors, as you might call them, continue to borrow and borrow and borrow on the never never, and then they impose higher and higher rates on each member of the community that happens to be a homeowner, that affects people. And there comes a point where you say, hang on, this is more than enough, and you've got more than the lion's share of what you're doing, and you're involved in areas that you have no right to be in. And of course, there's no sanctions. There's no sanctions to opt out. You can't, unless you've got an island. You're involved in a council, and they impose what they see arbitrarily at times as their point of view over you. And so I think this engagement, this two-way engagement between the individual and councils, between the individual and community, is most important. Now, Don's touched on something I'm going to, if you like, ring the bell about. And that is that he was involved for 30 years with the Voters Policy Association, with their, electoral local council involvement group. Sorry for the name, Don, I've slipped. Ratepayers Association, that's right. He's involved in that for 30 years. Now, don't think that someone's going to come along, put their hand up and just be a benevolent councillor. They're not there. They've got their own reasons for being there, and part of their reasons are for their own benefit. There's got to be community spirit, absolutely. But the thing is that they have their point of view. Now, if your point of view is equally as valid and it affects you, but it doesn't affect the councillor, you should be able to approach the councillor, discuss it, in a vigorous manner, and if the council is a person of integrity, they'll yield. And but the fact is, if they become aloof and disjointed from the electorate, from the individuals, then there are real problems. Ken Grundy.
Yes, Arnie, I'd just like to clarify one point you made, that these borrowings that we used to be able to have a poll on, and that same facility was available in South Australia, was no longer available. The councillors do have to approve that borrowing. So the point that Don was making is that the councillors might be unduly influenced by the staff, and they're proposing that this loan be taken out. But the point is that the ratepayers, they had to give their approval. They may have approved it, but they did have the last say. So don't just say it's the staff that are engineering this loan. They might be initiating it, but the council would have had to approve it, whether there was a poll of ratepayers or not.
Thanks, Ken, for that correction. Very important to, if we're going to discuss these things, to be as accurate as possible. And I appreciate the your feedback on that. Yes, so we're looking at councils. We're looking at attempting to find representation, attempting to restore a fair and equitable situation that you can be in agreement with in the community. Now, we're social beings. We work with each other well. We want to agree on things. We want to find a mutual benefit. We don't want someone to derive benefit at the expense of everyone else's. And there is a very important point to place on the table here, and I want to place it in front of you, and that is cultural inheritance. When we come into a community, in my local community, there were roads were already developed. The sewer systems, the water system, telephone, lights, ovals, facilities for senior people, hospitals, enormous amount of infrastructure. Now, I didn't do anything whatsoever to develop that. I inherited it. It's all part of my cultural inheritance as being a member of this community. Now, you put your hand up and you say, okay, all right, well, that's part of my inheritance. It is, and the use of it is. But if someone puts their hand up and says, well, hang on, I'm going to seize that particular thing and I'm going to derive benefit just for myself, they're expropriating, I think is the right word, what is a community asset. And that should not be. Now, we've talked about credit creation in the modern economy and the ability of banks to make money, create money out of nothing. And so the reverse of that is true, that when we see debt for equity swaps, when we see portions of council land or government-owned property handed over, that is the community's inheritance. And it's a sleight of hand. It's a sleight of hand. We've got to seriously look at these things about what is our inheritance, what actually does belong to the community, and what is a fair and equitable relationship between the individual and that community. And so council becomes very much a part of it. And it's not in isolation, but it becomes part of the bigger picture of what we call our state and what we call our nation. And so we've got to look at these things in order to understand them in isolation, but then take a step back and bring them into the greater picture. And so while I touched on credit creation, banking and finance, the fact is that when councils go, or the elected officials or the officers of the council go to borrow money, they're mortgaging against community assets. They belong to the community. And the fact is, hang on a sec, this isn't right. We already own that. How come if we do this project A and we've already done all these other projects, and then we've got to mortgage all our historical assets against it? Hang on, that's not right. That's not right. If we're going to do this, then let it stand alone on its own merit. And if that happens to be a particular thing, whether it's a bridge or it's a toll bridge or something like that, let it stand on its own merit and let the loan stand against it, and not a broader picture of mortgaging the whole world. I know as a homeowner, I certainly wouldn't want to see my children have to mortgage against my home for them to buy a home. They've got to stand alone and do it themselves. So I think all of these things are important when we start to piece together how councils work, how communities work, and also the if you like, finance works, which of course the finance is the mechanism how all these things can come together, which is subject to a different forum. I won't go any more about it. Don.
The situation where I'd like to enlarge a bit on what the situation was prior to amalgamation. Now, we'd had councillors serving for more than 20 years, and they get re-elected every time. Now, they knew everything in their riding like the back of their hand. They weren't paid, they were volunteers. And as a volunteer, they were efficient. They cared about the things. Now, when I was a councillor, I went and did jobs. There was a proposal to put a drain in a local town, but it had to be paid for partly by the residents. So I went and interviewed each resident, and none of them, they were all happy with the drain the way it was. So I reported that to the council, and that's what happened. So that is an example of what we're really trying to talk about, is to local people getting results. And I had a number of people in different areas, and I'd ring them up every few weeks and say, is there any problems with your area or anything happening where you live? And if I got a positive response, I'd bring that up at the council. So that was what used to happen and what should still happen.
Thank you, Don. That's right. That's a representative working hard to gauge what's going on in the community and to represent those concerns from the community to the forum, which is, of course, the council meeting. And that's its function. That's what their representation, the word, means. And I think you've demonstrated that in good fashion. Thank you for that, Don. Ken Grundy.
There's another aspect of worth noting, and that is the continuity that we used to have in South Australia. At least we had elections every 2 years, and half of the council would go out and half remain. So that meant rather than a whole new batch of councillors coming in and not being very familiar with the system or what had taken place before, we lost all of that, and there was a council not very far from where I live, and after the election they had a whole lot of new councillors. Not one of the old councillors was either re-elected or they retired. So we've lost that aspect of it, and you know, that's a system that our Senate employs. We only elect half of the Senate at each election unless there's a double dissolution. So, you know, there might have been perceived that there were problems in local government before amalgamation, but I'm reminded of our learned friend Wallace Clink, who said only last week that you don't solve a problem by enlarging its borders. And that's pretty true of what happened in local government. I think it's just got so big. And in my own example of where I live, when they amalgamated, there had been two, we call them works depots, where the graders and rollers and all that heavy equipment is stationed. One was in one council and the other one was in the other. And these bureaucrats thought that we'll tidy this up, we'll just have one. Well, of course, they're 40 kilometres apart, and as if the graders would be all coming out of one point to cover an area 40 kilometres away. It's just madness. So they soon realised that they had to keep the two depots open. But the interesting point was, well, you needed a manager in each of them, and then that also you had to have one above those two. So out the window went the so-called gains that they forecast for amalgamation.
Thank you, Ken. That's right. I think it's a spurious argument. It's always efficiency. You've got to I mean, I'm going to touch on this a little bit more because I've brought it up before, and that's if you don't start looking at this question of credit creation, if you don't start looking at money, if you don't start looking at our history. Now we've got a beautiful history of very well recorded by a bloke called Amos in his four books, the Commonwealth series, and one of the books is about the Commonwealth Bank, and for 12 years, Australia developed infrastructure. For 12 years they went out there, they built the east-west railway line, the woolen mills, the steamers, developed potential for oil refineries. I understand the Board of Works in Melbourne, significant infrastructure projects like dams and things like that were built by them during that first 12 years of the Commonwealth Bank as the People's Bank, issuing credit debt-free and issuing long-term low-interest loans. And I've got plenty of slides here. I won't bring them up now because it'd be too slow. But the thing is that at Griffith, New South Wales, there's some tiles on the branches there. I believe the Commonwealth Bank branch there, and it depicts what was going on in that period, I think it's 1912, 1914 to 1924, and the policy under the then Governor, Sir Denison Miller. Now, we come back to efficiencies, we come back to regionalisation, we come back to, I call it debt for equity swaps, where the assets of the community are handed over to clear a debt. Now, you've got to study this question, you've got to look very deeply at this question, because what they're doing is they're imposing policy over us on the justification that the numbers are going to become smaller, and I'm afraid I'm not convinced of that for a second. As Ken said, the two depots were there. You still needed site managers and you needed someone over the top. So the amalgamation isn't about efficiency. It's about control. It's about administrative control or bureaucracy. That's what it's about. So we've got to look again at this thing and go back to where we came from and find the fork in the road and renegotiate. Don Auchterlonie.
Well, they say the first thing to do is take the first step. So to renegotiate, we're going to have people who are able to work with their fellows to express, to generate enough pressure on various levels of government, mainly state governments at this point in time, so that reviews will take place. Now, for that to happen, people need to be informed of what could be and what used to be. You need some sort of a method of publicising such, and obviously this format we're in today is designed to do that, so that we just got to keep talking, and we've got to keep putting it up in front of the public before any real reforms are going to happen.
That's right. Thanks for that, Don. I'm going to bring up some website images in just a sec, and what it does is it'll show you the where you can start garnishing some information. Because the fact is, if you don't empower yourself, if you don't put yourself back under a position of scholarship, of learning and discipline, then we've lost before we start. But the fact is, if you do empower yourself, you do go after knowledge, and you pursue it, and you do pursue our history, find out what worked, how did it work, why did it work, and what worked well, and then represent this as your argument to say, hang on, this has happened before, we've fixed this problem before, we can do it again. And I'll put it back to Ken just while I continue to navigate through, so I can bring up some slides of what's out there and the information that's available. Ken Grundy.
Well, each state has a local government association, and once a year at least, the councils, the mayors and the CEOs attend these big conferences, and they accept resolutions from the various councils, and most of them are almost predictable, but there are some that try and achieve this financial relief that you perhaps have been talking about, Arnie, where we might be able to take advantage of some of the system is a bit like the Reserve Bank funding the East-West Railway. So as an illustration of the, what do I call it, the level of rot that has crept into these bodies, I'll just illustrate the point that my own council had a resolution that because there'd been a big survey of all of our roads and estimates of how many years before they'd all have to be rebuilt, etc. So we came up with this imaginary figure of so many $1 million that had to be found in the next 20 years. Well, of course, it was an horrific figure, and people were wondering, well, how can we ever achieve that? So I was aware of some of that finance available, as you mentioned, written about by Amos, and how the East-West Railway was erected and debt-free and all that sort of thing. So we went off to this local government association meeting with a resolution calling for perhaps just investigate what happened back in those earlier times, and whether some of this same sort of money could be made available to assist councils. And you know, you would have thought you were asking them to reach down a star or something, because there was just at the administrative level of this local government association, before the resolution even got to the body, they were onto the CEO of my council saying that we don't want this one discussed, get rid of that, mate. And unfortunately, we had one council meeting in my absence. I was away on holiday, and the CEO convinced the councillors that we perhaps ought to drop that resolution. So when I returned home, I was very, very disturbed by it, and it was too late to rectify it. But when I got to the LGA meeting, there was another resolution there that had to do with financing future works. So I attempted to amend it by bringing in this resolution that they'd culled out, and quickly the powers descended on me and what I was trying to do, and they just completely scotched it. So you know, we have a lot of work to do, and I don't want to give the impression in this forum that, you know, councils were squeaky clean before and that they're no good now. There is an element of there was good, and there's an element still there, but we have lost a lot of the facilities that we once had. I believe it's a bit of a retrograde step.
Thanks, Ken. And I just want to bring it up to the public's attention that a lot of work has been done to provide a repository of information, of which is going to be helpful if you're going to educate yourself and become active in your community, active in your council. Now, the Australian League of Rights website, as it is here, and that's the URL up the top there, and you'll notice this is the library. And then of interest in particular is the story of the Commonwealth Bank, which I've just highlighted there. You'll find it under Amos, and another document of critical interest, of specific interest, is actually if you go to the Bankwatch website, which is part of this, and there's a Yarra Glen report. This is what this is, the Yarra Glen report, Solving Local Government Financial Problems. Now, when we're talking about how local governments work, when we're talking about representing people, and when we're talking about the Commonwealth Bank financing not only significant infrastructure projects, but I highlight to you, ladies and gentlemen, that was also during the First World War, 1914 to 1924. And of course the First World War, 14 to 19, wasn't it? It was within that period of time. And Australia came out of that war debt-free. Now, I know that a few weeks back I published a document that showed that Britain, I think it was in 2014 or 15, finally paid off the World War I debt. Finally paid it off, 100 years after. Now, we came out of that First World War debt-free. Why is finance so important? Why is local government, local councils, representation, freedom so important? because one fashion is used to serve you as an individual and allow you to be as free as possible within the boundaries of responsibility, morality, responsibility, free, moral, responsible. And the other is to impose a burden on you that is not of living. It's a false burden. It's a flawed burden. They use trickery to do it. Central banking systems use trickery to do it. They impose a debt on you that's irredeemable. And as you can see, the First World War in Britain, I mean, when they finished that war, the campaign was completed. All the machinery of war was built. All the infrastructure to force that campaign into existence and to actually execute it was completed. And yet the debt, the man-made debt, went on for 100 years. And that is so wrong. It's backwards of where it needs to be. Now, if you want to start looking at your local council and then they turn around and they want to borrow money and they want to impose a loan, and then that loan is going to be transferred onto your progeny, onto your children, your grandchildren, and not cleared, the effect of that is that your rates are going to have to work it through. And it's a fraud, it's a trick. And they're not representing your best interests. They're not doing what they should be doing, which is pursuing policies that will actually allow you to be free. And so this is where it's at. This is where the rubber hits the road, where the individual can't walk away from this. If he walks away, hold on to your chains, because that's all you've got left. Don Auchterlonie.
Well, what more can I say? I mean, it gets back to people taking some action. It gets back to people doing some homework, doing some reading, doing some research, and it gets back to people. But of course, then it gets back to the question of how do you find out about all this knowledge that's available on this website, because that's the aim of this particular program, is to get it out to the people who are the audience. And the audience is wide. The audience is just about everybody who's able to work a computer. So that that's about the maximum we can do. We can put it out. We can work in our own areas, but people have got to find it and they've got to act on it.
Thanks, Don. That's right. And I will point out something here to bring it back to your attention, and that is that there's on this website, the library, there's a VPA handbook down here on the right-hand side, right-hand column, a VPA handbook. Now, coming back to the work that Don has done for 30 years involved in local council, and working with his group to attempt to have some say in what's going on. Now, the VPA handbook will just teach you how to hold a meeting, how to make a proposal, how to submit it to your representative, but on the basis that the first things first is, well, okay, you've got to ask yourself, can I do something? If I can do something, will I do something? Well, actually, it's gone past that. It's you must do something. You must do something. Our councils are the first port of call. You've got to start working with them, engaging yourself in what they're involved in. A lot of the policy that comes through council now actually comes further than the state government. I know that there's the Mayors Association that goes across to these overseas juntas, and it's held in association with the United Nations, and the program of development of infrastructure development for housing, sustainable development has got a big influence on the shape of your house, on the size of your house, on the footprint that it has on the land. These are very important things, because if you don't have sufficient land to grow your own food, at least grow some of your own food. I'm not suggesting that everyone needs an acre, but you certainly need something where you can grow something, where you can plant some fruit trees and have a beehive or something like that. That at least gives you a bit of self-reliance there. And you've got to consider all of these things one step at a time. What can I do? Well, if that's what I can do, then that's what I better do. and continue on. There is much to be done. Ken Grundy.
We're wondering why councils are so poorly financed. Their costs are going up like every business that we're involved with. Their costs are going to be greater next year than they are this year because they have staff. Whether there's too many or not, we won't worry about that. Whatever they've got, they're all going to get a wage rise. And the cost of electricity or fuel for the vehicles and tractors and graders, we know it's all going to be dearer. So we recognise that cost increase will be there. But in an earlier part of this forum, I did suggest that it was right and proper for the state who enact this local government business to have some direction on what council's role will be. But what we're coming across now, and you just gave a hint of it, I believe there, Arnie, where you're saying if some of these instructions come down from much higher bodies like the United Nations, and in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the Agenda 21, which is now seems to have names on it called Agenda 2030, and that's really a plan for the 21st century that's signed off in Rio de Janeiro some years ago. It bears the signature of firstly Julia Gillard and more latterly Julie Bishop. In other words, both of our major parties in government have agreed to it. Then we find that we're having to obey many of these plans of this sustainable program. And of course, energy costs, climate change is all coming through. And out of the top, in Victoria, the new Local Government Act that is still at this stage only a proposal is going to empower councils to be the big inspector of all households and business consumers of power, that's gas and electricity, because the real aim of it is to reduce the consumption of power, gas and electricity by 60%, mind you, and to police that, the smart meters will come into play because that keeps a good record of when you've used the power, etc. But the council will have inspectors that can come to your property and demand to see records that you have been forced to keep. And if you haven't reduced your power significantly, they have the power to fine you, and the fines are very, very significant. If you can't pay them, they can claim part of your property. So just for a moment, think of these elderly retired people that will be burdened with having to keep records of their power consumption. I mean, they'll just die with their leg in the air. It's Sovietisation like we've never seen before. So the fact that the states are wanting to impose this, and Victoria will be only the first example, you can bet the others will come into line once it gets through in Victoria. So we're hoping on the Victorians that really get off their butt and lobby their councillors and their state members of parliament to say that we're just not having a bar of this, because it is completely over the top.
Thank you, Ken. That's a very valid point, and I know we were looking at some documents that have only just surfaced this week on these Victorian proposals. And the fact is, as Ken said, don't think for a second, just because it's in Victoria, it won't happen in your state. Regional councils were set up and established as a directive that came down from the UN. This sustainable development, Agenda 21, this is all UN stuff. The fact that house blocks are now 1/4 the size of what they used to be, and multi-storey. This is all part of their policy. This is emanating from what is essentially a central bureaucracy called the United Nations. There's no chance of representation there. And there's certainly no initiative coming from local communities to do this. Because what it's done, I noticed the other day, a document I saw from IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, it showed that the cost of housing has tripled in real terms from one generation to the next. It's tripled. And how dare, as a policy, they make houses so expensive that our children have to be indebted, like the Brits were, First World War for 100 years. We watched the Japanese become indebted, intergenerational, indebted to buy homes, and now it's come here. Our children will be indebted, and their children, the children of our children, will still be mortgaged to clear these debts because they're so astronomical. Why is it so important? It's because the financial system is the tool that the bureaucrat, the fascist in charge, the totalitarian, it's the tool that is used. And if you think there's a difference between communism, fascism, and corporatized capitalism, you're confused, because it's one and the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. An elite group, small, cable, coterie, whatever you want to call it, and they rule the lot. And we've got to look at it. How do we start undoing it? First of all, you've got to become active. Then you've got to look at, well, what's possible, and if you've got local councils that you can engage in, then engage. And if you haven't, then sort out your local council. Start at the local level, and get people in there who will engage, who will talk to you. It's most important. Now, okay, we've highlighted that there are things that you can do. None of it's easy. But the fact is, this forum is a starting point. Advertise the forum. Watch the other videos. There's plenty. There will be more coming. And see what you can do. And engage and participate. Do your training. There's on the League website. There's plenty on there for you to start reading and start looking at. And turn the telly off. It's not going to happen unless you engage. Don Auchterlonie.
I was at the ratepayers meeting of the local amalgamated council last night, and we had the new CEO present and three of her directors. Now, our previous CEO was once asked, how many people are working for the Shire? She said, one. All the others work for me. Now, I don't know whether has anybody asked that question of the new CEO. Certainly didn't happen last night. But the people who become CEOs, they don't stay around for very long. They come for 3 or 4 years and move on. And if, for example, a Shire wants to get really tough with a CEO, they won't get another one. They've got a sort of a league amongst themselves, I suppose you could say. So that this situation is what's happening now, and quite obviously it's enormously expensive. For example, our councillors are paid $14,000 a year, and our mayor is paid $74,000 a year, and our current mayor's been the mayor for 3 years in a row. So all this has got to be paid for, and bigness is not better as regarding cost. I think that's obvious.
Thanks, Don. That's exactly right. Now I'm going to just cut across back to our website, the ALOR website, and I'll highlight down here again on the right-hand column, just below the VPA handbook, Voters Policy Association Handbook, is a book by Jeffrey DeQ Walker, The People's Law, Citizens Initiative, Referenda and Recall. And it's a copy of there. I'm pretty sure it's a PDF. It's a faithfully produced PDF of his book. It's a very important book for you to look at, because it will show you that there are actual mechanisms out there where you can actually bring your councillor and your bureaucrat to order. We don't have them implemented, but if you read the book and understand that there are actual mechanisms that people have pre-thought through before, then they're the points that you can actually start to present some leverage to your CEO, to your Shire officers, to your local councillors. You can present leverage that Citizens Initiative is a very real thing. The Swiss have had it for about 150, 170 years, and reasonably stable society. I think it's very important that we look at these mechanisms, consider them, and get them out into the public. Because when a bureaucrat hands down a Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development, that comes from the United Nations. I mean, hands up, who was consulted on that? I mean, seriously, who was consulted? Who was asked to quarter the block size? Who was asked to have multi-storey buildings? All this green energy, windmills and things like that, tripling the cost of power, tripling the cost of homes. I mean, who asked for that? I certainly didn't, and I know none of my children did. Ken Grundy.
Arnie, you just referred to some of the things available in the library, but this Victorian Local Government Act, I would like people to be able to contact you at the forum there if you give an address later, and they can get this document that talks about the proposed Victorian Local Government Act for 2018, and its reference in particular to the Victorian Energy Efficiency Target. That's VEET, they call it.
Can I just jump in here for a sec, Ken?
Yeah.
Because this forum is called Councils at the Crossroads, and I'm just going to jump across to the Crossroads website, because I saw today where there is actually an article on the it's not on the Crossroads, it's on the blog, it's on the ALOR blog. On the ALOR blog there is actually an article on local councils in Victoria, and the case that's there. Can Victoria's local government 2018 bill be constitutionally challenged by a lawyer? I'll just bring it up here. Let's have a look, just so you can see it. Now that's the blog.alor.org. If you go to the ALOR parent site, you'll see that we've got two blogs. The Crossroad is one of them. Coming back to ALOR, you'll see the Crossroads is one on the left in the yellow, and the blog alor.org is the one on the right. And this has got references to some of the documents you're referring to, Ken, in that article. The writer who's a lawyer. He's led us towards it, at least for discussion and possible consideration of constitutional challenge. So I'll bring it back to you, Ken. Thank you very much for that point.
Well, I just wondered really whether some people might like to see this document itself, whether we could make that available to people who inquire.
We certainly can. I can put it up on our library. I could possibly do that this afternoon. I'll see. We might actually start a new area in red, and I think I'll call it local government. So it'll be on the second right hand column, and where the L's are. Let's have a look. I'll just bring people back to the image. So this where it is Leo and Larrikin, Levisque, and we'll have it Liberal Party of Australia, and just next to that below it will be local government. I'll put it in red, similar that the Banking Royal Commission is up here and the Bank of England is up there. So we'll work on that. That'll be a target for me. Thanks, Ken.
Good on you.
Okay, and just handing over to Don. Anything further to say, Don?
Well, not really. We can't talk all the afternoon.
No worries, that's fine.
I think we've said enough.
No worries, you've done. Actually, that's a good, honest answer. I appreciate that, Don. I'll take it on the chin. We're 53 minutes into it. Thank you, Don, and thank you, Ken, for today. We'll pick it up again in perhaps a week.
I think it's been quite valuable.
Yeah, so do I. All right, this is Arnis Luks at the Crossroads. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? This is Arnis Luks signing off for the Crossroads.